Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. This is Dr. Muhammad Shafiq, lecturer in philosophy at Department of Islamic and Pakistan Studies, CUST. I'm your course instructor in Introduction to Logic, and the course code is PHI 101. This is lecture number 5, and today we are going to discuss the historical evolution of logic. Before we move on to the different topics of logic as a course, first we need to understand, we need to look into historical evolution of logic in order to understand it in its proper context. So let's move on and see how did logic evolve throughout the history. The course, the lecture outline today, it consists upon the history of logic and different phases of logic, and also we are going to briefly discuss different logicians who are very important in the history of logic. So we start with the great name of Aristotle. If you know, Aristotle is one of the greatest minds of human history who has written extensively upon almost every aspect of human knowledge, and he is considered to be a genius. In fact, he is one of the major philosophers in history of philosophy, and he was the pupil of Plato, who's called Aflatun in Urdu, and Plato was a pupil of Socrates. So Aristotle basically learned a lot from Plato, although he did not agree with Platonic concepts. But that's a different debate. So let's concentrate upon Aristotle being a father of logic. Aristotle is called father of logic because he was the one who, although there was the science of logic before him, but he was the one who gave it a systematic shape. Basically, what he did, he separated logic from the totality of philosophy. Before him, logic was not differentiated from the totality of philosophy, and it was just generally called and considered philosophy. Aristotle wrote 6 treatises on logic only, which are called organum. His treatises on logic are considered as the Bible of logic because these are still studied and are very much important in study of logic, and they are studied till modern times today, throughout medieval times. So since the time of Aristotle, his treatises are studied as a Bible of logic up till now. We cannot understand, or in fact we cannot discuss logical principles or traditional logic if we don't understand or if we don't know the principles he devised for logic. His pupil Theophrastus of Lesbos, quite difficult terms for you probably, but you'll get used to these. So Theophrastus of Lesbos was one of his pupils, and his contribution in logic is that he kind of polished and further developed his master's science, which is logic, and he developed hypothetical reasoning. He introduced hypothetical reasoning in logic, which are also called conditional reasoning, and very important and integral part of logic as a course. Then one of his other pupils, whose name was Boethius or Boethius, he formulated organon from Greek to Latin. Basically, what he did, he translated Aristotle's works on logic, which consisted upon 6 treatises, and when he translated these from Greek to Latin, that brought a huge impact upon human knowledge, and especially that had a great influence upon medieval knowledge system, because at that time the language of medieval times was Latin, and when he translated uh, Aristotle's works from Greek to Latin, it became much more easier for people to understand logic, and that basically brought a big revolution that got people interested in logic, and that's how it had a great impact upon medieval times. After Aristotle, another great name in the history of logic, which is considered to be very important, is that of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas was, as evident from his name, he was a saint, but he was a kind of different saint because he did not believe in the belief system of Christianity blindly. He did not follow it blindly, but he wanted some rational explanation and rational interpretation of Christian beliefs. That is why he is considered one of the most influential figures of medieval Christian world. His contribution is basically what he did was he developed logic in medieval times. And this is one of his greatest contribution in the development of knowledge in medieval times, when he introduced logic and people started studying it. They started gaining knowledge about logic, became more logical. He basically introduced logical ideas of Aristotle to the Christian world, and that's how it gave birth to a rationalist Christianity in a way, because after that people tried to rationalize Christian beliefs, which changed the course of nature, the course of history of Christianity. That is why St. Thomas Aquinas was entitled, people called him as a doctor of church, for his great contributions, not only towards logic but also towards Christianity, bringing Christianity in harmony with logical thinking, or in other words, made his attempts to rationalize Christianity and introduced Aristotelian concepts of logic to the medieval and Christian world. Another great figure in the history of logic is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was one of the very popular figure in early modern history of philosophy. He was a great philosopher and writer, and he was the one who criticized Aristotelian logic. Basically, it took great courage to criticize something which was considered to be the Bible of logic. And it's not that he just criticized it, he severely and negatively criticized the traditional logic of Aristotle. And it wasn't by any means like just criticism for the sake of criticism, but he had logical arguments for that. His book Novum Organum is the manifestation of his criticism on Aristotle's traditional logic. And he tried to replace it, or he came up with a new tool. He introduced a new tool for the rational mind, for the rational thinking, which is called inductive reasoning. So he is considered to be the pioneer of inductive logic. And if you know inductive reasoning or inductive logic provides the foundation or basis for the modern science. And the science basically, the methodology it uses is called inductive method. And that is how we can see that Francis Bacon is one of the most important figures in the history of knowledge because he introduced a new way of logic, a new tool for reasoning, which is called inductive reasoning. And the modern science is based upon this inductive reasoning and observation. So in a way we can say that the development of modern science owes big time to Francis Bacon and his inductive method, inductive logic. Then comes Muslim logicians. The Muslim logicians are not far behind from the Western logicians or Western philosophers. In fact, there are certain great names in the history of philosophy and history of human knowledge which had faith in Islam, that is why they were called Muslim philosophers. There were Muslim philosophers before Avicenna and Averroes. They were called Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi. In fact, what they did, they studied Aristotelian logic and they translated this logic into Arabic and introduced it to the Muslim world and the Arab world. Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, they introduced the logic to Arabic and Muslim world, but these were Avicenna and Averroes, which are normally named as Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, who contributed a lot in terms of commenting, having commentaries on Aristotelian logic. And their contribution is as such that it was Ibn Rushd, the Spanish, who was a master in logical argument, and he refuted the arguments of Al-Ghazali, who had come to the conclusion that philosophy was useless. So Ibn Sina has also contributions in human knowledge in general and in logic particular. He was also a great physician, and he has a great role in the history of medical science. In fact, his books on medical sciences are still studied in Europe, although in Muslim world we don't have any value for those books now anymore. But anyway, this was Ibn Rushd of Spain, who basically was one of those great philosophers who introduced philosophy, who introduced Greek thought to Europe. And that is how they got acquainted with Greek philosophy and logic and all the development and progress in Europe today is owed big time to the Muslim philosophers who not only contributed and commented on Aristotelian logic and Greek philosophy, but also have this great credit to introduce it to the European world and to drag them out of the dark ages, as they would call it. So this is the historical evolution of logic from Aristotelian time to modern times, and these are the few logicians and philosophers who are quite important in the history of logic. For this purpose, as I have already recommended you these 4 books, and if you get hold of these books, that would be very beneficial for you in order to understand the basic concepts of logic and philosophy. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. Do get in touch with me by all means, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. So till next lecture, take good care of yourself and your loved ones and stay safe.